Two important documents called loan estimates and closing disclosures are a source of many questions for and from borrowers. During a home buying or refinance process, it's possible a borrower would receive multiple versions of these two documents from a lender. The most common order you receive these in are the initial loan estimate, redisclosure of loan estimate, and that's usually due to a material change in cost that's not in the borrower's favor, the preliminary closing disclosure, and the final closing disclosure. Here are the similarities and differences to better familiarize you with each. The loan estimate, called an LE, is a 3-page estimate a lender generates for you at the beginning of the loan process, or even while you are still looking at various properties. There is no cost or obligation for a loan estimate. The goal of the initial loan estimate is to cover all potential costs a borrower may encounter for the purchase or refinance. A redisclosure of the loan estimate occurs if there are additional fees encountered after the initial loan estimate. Some common fees that we see that trigger a redisclosure are verification of employment fees through a third party your employer uses, like the work number, or a final appraisal inspection fee for government loans after the appraisal occurs and there are required repairs. The closing disclosure, called a CD, is a more detailed 5-page version of all of the numbers relating to the purchase, broken down to a greater level of detail and covering the actual cost incurred for your transaction. Once the lender receives the title work and the homeowner's insurance and any other required closing documents, they generate a preliminary closing disclosure. The preliminary closing disclosure is not the final numbers and is like the initial loan estimate in that it contains some unconfirmed numbers. Don't be alarmed at the first version or run out and get your final check or send a wire when you receive it. Once the preliminary closing disclosure is open or acknowledged, then the lender and the settlement company will begin the balancing process and exchanging invoices, including which items were paid outside of closing, tax prorations, and homeowner's insurance, as well as any other applicable costs such as HOA fees, condo fees, or flood insurance. Acknowledgement of the prelim CD starts a mandatory 3-day wait before closing can occur. So why these two documents? The goal of the loan estimate is to get close to the actual numbers that a buyer or refinancer will pay along the way and in total by closing. The loan estimate format is also standardized and resembles the closing disclosure format. The loan estimate is in the same format in order to familiarize a borrower with that format of the CD so that when they receive the final closing disclosure, it looks very similar to what they received all along and they can understand everything. The loan estimate also makes it easier to compare multiple estimates from different lenders. Since the information is standardized, you can compare each item from one lender to another. For example, a cost you might want to compare is the administrative fee a lender charges, which can vary up to plus or minus $400 by lender. An initial loan estimate is binding for a lender but non-binding for a borrower. What that means is that if there are some costs that are not disclosed correctly, the lender may be responsible for paying them on behalf of the borrower. For this reason, many lenders over-disclose their loan estimates to overestimate the costs, so borrowers are not unpleasantly surprised by higher costs at closing. One of the common fees to over-disclose is transfer tax because it is one the lender must pay if under-disclosed or not disclosed, and that can be thousands of dollars. The correct transfer tax amount will be reflected on the final closing disclosure. It is also very difficult to know upfront every potential cost associated with a home purchase or refinance. Sometimes there are costs that are not known upfront but that come up after inspections or appraisals. Other times, some of the costs may or may not apply depending on what the borrower or seller chooses to have done before closing that is not required by the lender. A loan estimate stays high level throughout the process. It does not get down to the level of detail that a closing disclosure does. For example, a loan estimate will not reflect that an appraisal has already been paid outside of closing, even though the borrower usually pays for this expense at the front end of the process. The final closing disclosure will get down to that level of detail and has columns to reflect items paid by the buyer, seller, or outside of closing. Once the closing disclosure is balanced and finalized, the lender or title company will send it to the borrower with the final amount due at closing. Keep in mind that a very secure way to bring the final money to closing is via a cashier's check made payable to the title company. Many prefer or are required due to geographic constraints to send the money electronically via wire. It's worth noting that sending a wire can be very risky. If it goes to the wrong place, it may not be recovered. We do see wire fraud attempts frequently, and the schemes are very sophisticated. It's always best to check from a phone number for the title company that you know is from them and verify their wire instructions over the phone before sending a wire. Part 2 of this discussion, released later this week, will be how to read a loan estimate and closing disclosure.